Don't miss a debrief on this one because we do go over the potential usage and sightings of any optics-ready or modernized Kalashnikovs in the current Ukrainian battlefields and what we think about some of these features that we see on this particular rifle at the timestamp below. So we'll see you after the run in the debrief.
Yes, on it, target number 1.
Oh, of course.
Impact. Impact. Yeah, 200. Impact. Impact.
Okay, I'm ready.
Impact, dead center. Impact.
Nice.
Okay, 300.
Okay.
Impact. Impact. Okay, far left, 350. Impact. Just off the left edge. Impact.
Nice. Man, that wind is relentless.
Yeah. 400. Just high over his left shoulder. Just high, just left. Quarter target on both. Impact. Impact. Okay, 450. Impact. The impact was just on the bottom edge. I believe that second shot sailed just low to the right. Impact.
Okay.
500, final target. Impact. Impact.
Woo!
Holy crap.
Ah, that is more like it. Basically this is a Bulgarian SLR 104 FR, which means it is using the old Russian AK74 TDP. Despite all the alpha kit that is put onto it, at the core of it, it is the same as the 70s model Kalash. However, of course, with the modernization, as we've discussed at length in the classic videos, an update to the optical sighting device, having a solid mounting system to the rifle makes a substantial difference on the effect. Josh, I'd like to do a little bit more testing on this because the 65 grains seem to work in the wind a little bit better than the other variety that we've shot.
Yep.
It's a very handsome looking weapon system, and a weapon system that has been associated with many organizations, many units that carries along with a lot of mystique for us in the West. So with that, shall we see them at the debrief?
Let's do it.
See you there.
We've made some new merch. You'll see under slateBlackIndustries.com that we've dropped some sweet patches. We've released the Enemy at the Gate Sniper Dual Pair with Vasily written on the Mosin-Nagant Sniper and König on the Kar 98K Sniper. These patches directly help the funding of our channel, and we have limited stock on hand, so get them while they last.
All right, welcome back into the debrief for what ended up being a shockingly phenomenal run for an AK platform. One that actually, when we look back at the scoreboard, is going to be at the top of all of the AKs that we've shot. So, Henry, I mean, kudos on what was just extremely well shot run.
So what was it though? What's the difference between this one and, let's say, the last time we took it out? Which you remember the last time we took it out? I don't know if the audience probably doesn't. It's gone through quite a bit of a facelift between now and then, though. So if you look back at the Tulip 1P29 video, which you may not know, is the same exact rifle as this one. In fact, this rifle is technically, the Bulgarian SLR 104 FR is technically a blueprint copy of the Russian AKs74 to the T. So it's actually a really good representation of the really old school 1980s, the same model as a 1980s one. It's just wearing some different clothes, per se.
Yeah. So the last time we took this out, right, the weather conditions were abysmal.
Yeah.
It was raining unexpectedly, and the temperature was down like 20 degrees over what it was meant to be. It was the infamous day of the shorts, I think the internet has dubbed it.
Arsenal 104 FR.
The white guy with shorts when it was raining and freezing outside.
Shivering. Yes, shivering cold.
You were physically shivering that day. Well, but so this time we shot it, we had warmer clothes on and it wasn't raining, but the weather conditions weren't necessary. I didn't think it was necessarily that much better, per se.
No, it was really windy, like really windy on the day, such that even when you look down on the targets, the vegetation was like fully blowing on the target berms and in the grass. Not to mention us up on the elevated tower, we were getting, a serious amount of wind up at the slightly higher elevation there off the ground. With all of that said, we've got a rifle which, despite the conditions not being great, performed significantly better than the last time we took it out because we had made some, well, maybe because we made some adjustments. That's what we want to really explore in this conversation. But even more than that, you mentioned something to me after that run, which is that felt like it was a modern firearm that we would have been shooting out of, say, some of like the current production NATO factories. Like, explore that with us a little bit more.
Okay, so I would say almost. There's still some certain things that are not quite NATO. The lack of a cheek weld, the chin weld, which I know there's a Zenitco PT1 stock that raises chin weld to a cheek weld. But even with that, it's a skeleton stock, so it doesn't feel exactly the same. Some of the parts of the AKs74 DNA, you just physically, you cannot change it. I mean, that's how the rifle was built, right?
So even in spite of the score being like right up there with some of the like top performing rifles, I mean, this was a top performing score. In spite of that, you're seeing there's still some pieces to it that you just can tell are just not quite the same.
Not quite the same is the right word. It's not bad. It's not quite the same. Because if you look at the score, it's actually rivaling some NATO rifles, which is, as a former NATO-affiliated soldier, working on the NATO border, it is, right? To see potential adversary rifles challenge the rifles that you use. But the Kalashnikov platform is interesting. When you modernize it, you get such a high height over bore. And when it comes to long-range shooting, it most certainly is a detracting factor. But that high optic placement, especially with hollow type optics like EOTech's, hologram type optics, easier to use night vision, faster in CQB environments, that heads-up display, and might I say almost easier to work with body armor even, because the shorter Warsaw Pack stocks are almost easier, especially when you have it shorter to you and you have the higher heads-up display. It's really interesting. So when you're talking about a modernized Kalashnikov, right? Once you modernize it, it's easy to get better CQB favoring characteristics. But how do you favor it for the distance, right? Having a solid mounting surface is one of the first and most important pieces. Your side mounts are okay. They're not great. At the end of the day, they're mounted to sheet metal receivers. So you still could get some type of variances to it. You may not get the same type of zero. I mean, by all means, it's okay. So that Zenitco B33 dust cover, integrated with the front handguard, I felt was pretty rock solid as a really good base platform to mount any type of optic to begin with. Now, on top of that, you chose the 2-dot bullet drop compensated EOTech, which I also think was important because having 2 reference points, even though it's some small thing like that, it makes a huge difference when you're trying to shoot distance, because I'm able to use 1 dot at the 300 meter-ish, 350 yard zone, and then the second dot to raise it up to the 500 yard zone. And so that gives me a pretty good dual dot, sort of a long range, short range aiming, battlefield aiming solution. And then on top of that, using your magnifier, even though magnification doesn't necessarily equal a more accurate rifle, right? It adds to your situational awareness. Now, I will say though, I love magnifiers because you could unhook it and you have a much lighter package than an LPVO that's hooked onto the rifle. So responding to short range engagement is a lot easier. And then for longer distances, you could just QD it back on and shoot it. Your optical quality is it's difficult to compare the optical quality of that to even, let's say, a more budget-friendly LPVO like a Primary Arms SLX, even the Strike Eagles have a better optical quality than a magnifier going through an EOTech. But it's better for situational awareness than not having it per se. And it's hard to describe.
Well, you've gone through a lot of stuff there. So let's finalize the commentary there on the situational awareness and sort of what you're talking about with respect to that. And then there was one other thing that you mentioned during that conversation I want to circle back to. So with respect to the situational awareness elements, I think part of what you're saying is, A, you're able to identify what's going on downrange better with magnification, right? Like that's sort of what that breaks down to. The amount of magnification we're talking about in this instance being 3 power is sufficient to pretty much get us where we need to be going from a aiming use perspective and sort of kind of from a PID use perspective. I think PIDing beyond like maybe 300 yards, maybe 300 meters ish area with only 3 power gets like kind of crappy depending on what you're shooting at. Some would even say it's much closer than that depending upon what you're shooting at and how your target is presented. Obviously, we're shooting on a static clean range with white targets. So, noted. The other half of that point of commentary, though, I think is we're talking about the 2-dot EOTech. And I think some of the viewers who have been with us for a while will probably remember back. I shot the AK Alpha trainer build with that same 2-dot EOTech, but without the magnifier. And if you'll remember, I really, really disliked it because I felt like the 2 dots for me at like 400 to 450, where I started to need to use that second dot or have the top dot above the target, I was struggling because I was seeing like the dots bleeding together with the target behind it. Whereas I think in this instance, we've got the magnifier behind it, which gives you a cleaner look through that reticle, allowing you to better use the 2 reference points. Plus, we're getting rid of, at least for me, it gets rid of some of that pluminess that does exist, or the pixelation, if you want to call it. I think that's how we described it before, the pixelation that exists within the EOTech reticle.
I think a lot of people sort of downplay the importance of a magnifier when it comes to shooting at any distance, just because they're using a red dot and the red dot has some type of a bullet drop built into it, whether it is the EOTech version right here or some of the ACSS HoloSuns that we've done in the past.
Yep.
Because what you could do in that instance, where you're talking about it plumes, you could actually dial it all the way to where it's barely visible and you get a lot less plume. But then at the same time, your target acquisition is a lot slower.
But with the use of the magnifier, you can actually afford to dial it at least for me, I find I can dial it lower with the magnifier than if I don't have the magnifier. Like if I leave if I set it at like setting X, that's not visible to my naked eye, but then flip a magnifier up, there are instances where I can actually see that, at a given setting. So not visible to my eye without a magnifier, but visible with, which again, to your point, allows you to have a cleaner overall reticle as it relates to the target. So definitely a good point of conversation. So the one other piece that I wanted to talk about is you talked through the concept of the cheek weld and how having for the modernization purposes and how we typically think about employing like tactical carbines in a modern fighting format, it's all heads up. It's all your head is up, your armor's on, and you're sort of like looking up instead of trying to crane your neck forward, and sort of look out the top portion of your eye with your eyes flexed up. You're sort of heads up. You've got your eyes straight through the optic is optimal. You mentioned that the cheek weld or lack of a cheek weld, if you will, is a negative on your ability to shoot at distance. Talk us through where you see that negative coming into play on the distance shots. Because obviously it didn't look like it impacted you all that much.
Well, I guess it didn't look like it, but there's two things that you're fighting through with the Kalashnikov when you're shooting at distance, right? One is what you're talking about, the lack of cheek weld, because that detracts from stability. And having a stable platform is key for shooting at distance targets. Now, the other thing that the Kalashnikov has that detracts from it is the magazine. The magazine sticks really far out down the bottom of it. So if you look at how I have to pad it, it's not just the rifle bag, but it's more stuff padded on top. I have to build it up enough to clear that magazine on the bottom to really get a stable platform, which if you're not shooting in prone, which in a lot of combat positions you may not be shooting in prone, I mean, that may not be an issue, but it's just one less stable platform that you could use, right? I mean, what's good for it is you could monopod it and still shoot it. So those are two characteristics from your Warsaw Pact type rifles that really you need to fight through or you need to get used to. And I would say through the years I've gotten more and more used to it. And I would say with the magnifier is actually easier than the 1P29, because the 1P29, if you watch me shoot it, my eye was right up there to the optic, meaning I had to actually push my neck as far forward as possible, but then get my eye into that really short field of view to actually get a good picture on it. And then it couldn't be too close, though, because if it was too close on that optic, I would have bumped the optic and moved the physical optic, because the mount moves the elevation on the 1P29. But on the magnifier, it's a lot more forgiving.
Right. Okay. So do you find that when you're shooting in the prone position with a higher optic height, that the advantages you get from being sort of more relaxed and not craning your neck when you're shooting heads up from a standing or say kneeling position, you have to give some of that back because you end up having to sort of crane your neck back in order to see up through the optic and when you're in the prone position?
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things. It's trainable. You could train yourself out of it, but you have to train yourself out of it. So it's not as plug and play as some of, let's say, like a SCAR. A SCAR has a very comfortable cheek piece that places your cheek exactly where your head is supposed to go to the rifle, and there's no question about it. It comes from factory like that. Now, whether you switch it out to an ACR stock, it's up to you. But the Kalashnikov just is not like that unless you get some type of an aftermarket stock to readjust your cheek piece,
right?
Like the PT1. which the PT1 does have a cool feature to where you could quick release the cheek piece and drop it down to shoot heads up.
So with all that said, we talked about how this rifle's been shot before, had a materially worse score. Granted, the conditions weren't quite as good, but But this current run was shot in, high variable winds. It was still not definitely by any sense of the imagination like a cherry-picked day or an easier run by, virtue of luck or unluck in any of the situations or circumstances. But it was a materially better run. Are we basically saying that we're attributing, a decent chunk of that to modernized optics on a solid mounting platform and an optic that gave you some form of multi-dot reference point for various distances? I mean, is that what this entire conversation thus far can be broken down to?
I would say partially. What we know for sure, yes, is the optical solution is much better than any of the early gen modernization Soviet solutions that we have out there. Now, some of the other questions that I have that maybe we could answer it at a further date would be the ammunition. We used a heavier grain ammunition, which presumably is longer, so it should have better ballistic coefficient. The other piece of the puzzle then also comes down to the handguard. Mm-hmm. The handguard, as you know, took the might of the Soviet hammer to install. So this is a theory, and we will test it down the road. I'm wondering if that handguard actually takes some of the strain off of the barrel, kind of like a free float handguard would. I don't know. Again, that's
or at least some form of a harmonic dampener device or dampener that you might apply to some firearms that aren't free floated, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, could it have that type of effect? I don't know. But those are the few differences that we've taken for this one. We used better, heavier grain ammunition, which is presumably better for distance shooting.
Slightly, too. I don't want to exaggerate that point. It's not like we went from 55 M193 to 77
right.
TMKs in the 5.56 world. Like, this is 62 grain ball. It's not like it's dramatically different. But your point remains. It was a variable that we changed. And to be honest, to anybody who's going to inevitably ask, well, why did you do that? Well, frankly, like the ammunition situation in the world right now is not optimal. So we're kind of rolling with what we got.
Yeah, it's what we have. Which a lot of times you roll with what you have.
That's right.
So the other part, I think the most important would be the handguard. Mm-hmm. I think that requires us to further delve into it. Maybe shoot a couple, targets and compare it with the different types of brands of ammunition or whatever. See if that actually has any type of discernible difference between the accuracy.
And what I would say is, notably to that point, this rifle was I think a sub 3-inch gun on a 90% grouping when we clocked it for the AK accuracy video. Mm-hmm. But the way that you were able to correct misses on this run, granted, only 3 of them for the whole run, but it was basically, I gave you where the round went, and then you were able to immediately make a correction on the next shot, much like you would with, like, say, a sub 2-inch gun. Mm-hmm. where you have a much better ability to control your cone of fire, or your cone of fire is just simply tighter and you're able to kind of put it exactly where you want based off of a correction. So again, maybe some of that was purely luck, which is possible with cones of deviation. Just because it's a 3-inch gun doesn't mean that, or a 2.9-inch gun doesn't mean that every round is going to be on the absolute extremes of those things. But again, to your point, it's worth probably delving into and circling back on in a future video.
Yep.
So our conclusion then is that the modern optic played a significant role in our ability to make improvements on this particular firearm's ability to shoot the course. And frankly, we've generally seen that presented as what most people with this particular loadout are using. Up until recently.
Well, recently, as in late February, we started seeing the reality of certain things. slick AK-12s, and on top of that, I mean, just not many optics used in certain theaters of operations.
Right. So we have active conflicts going on where you would imagine that these optics would be in play based upon the media that we had seen put forward or presented going back years, going back the last decade of, media coming out of Russia or media coming out of the US documenting what has been seen or profiled or put forward from Russia. At least that's what I've seen.
And the Russian regulars is a very spotty term, right? We've seen a lot of slick AK-12s. We've seen actually every now and there you'll see an FSB with a modernized Kalashnikov in that theater of operation. Now, I will say this: if you look back into our AK modernization video, at the very end of it, I specifically said, if some conflict touched off, it is more likely that you'll see soldiers with slick AKs optimizing the brutally effective rifle. For the large part, the Russian military still favors its heavy mechanized infantry doctrine, where the armor does the fighting and the infantry protects the armor. You likely won't see regulars using the latest modernized AK-12. But they still may be rolling with a T-90 main battle tank. Because the Russian doctrine is to push heavy armor and use the infantry to protect the heavy armor and focus on using heavy armor for fighting. Whether it's mech infantry, using BMPs or BMDs, or actual main battle tanks pushing along. It's just modernization for the infantry small arm is not as prolific as you would think.
Right.
Or as you would be led to think in,
That's it.
Let's say,
That's
publications.
That's it, 100%. And interestingly enough, I mean, that assessment has turned out to be like pretty spot on, almost as if there's some experience or, a background knowledge going on there based on theaters of operation people have participated in over periods of time. But that's neither here nor there.
Right.
But even to that point, though, it was also something where obviously when we look at, whether it's so hard to know within the context of media that's being put out right now of the active conflicts going on in the invasion of Ukraine. You really don't know what you're looking at, to be honest. It's relying on sources on the ground. And, frankly, I don't have any of those directly. So, you're relying on somebody else's interpretation of what you're seeing. So I want to be very clear that what we're describing here is our interpretations of what we've seen to this point. The way we think about things in the sphere, or at least the way I think about things in the sphere of the, the first world countries, the United States or NATO countries, or as I would have thought, even the countries participating in this current conflict and invasion, I would have thought everybody would have been running optics, but you sort of had called that ahead of time and said, no, that's not going to be how it would go down.
Well, I'd say this. You and I are not in. I mean, we're married, but online dating is a big thing, right? So you could look at someone's online profile all day long and come up with certain ideas about them, but until you go on that first date or the subsequent dates, you may not know how that person is.
Are you saying that we got catfished into thinking that
I did not say
certain
that.
forces were really way more equipped and outfitted than they currently are?
I did not say that. I'm just saying you never know until something breaks out and you actually get to see.
You've shown on the show numerous times that in all of these environments, you can be very effective with irons, but it just seems like with optics, you just gain that extra advantage. The idea of it being the force multiplier is not a trope. It really is effective when you're looking at things from a small arms perspective and ability to employ them.
So Josh, what if we push this on to Speedway?
I mean, that does seem like the next reasonable thing to do, especially after such a phenomenal run. Do you think that you're going to be able to tag a 650-yard target with an AK?
That's going to be quite a difficult task, but I'm ready to take that challenge.
Well, guys, until next time, we'll see you on the range.
Impact! Neutralized! Impact! Neutralized! Impact! Neutralized!
716 is Steel 96, 4 Vic, 8 packs, Redcon 1, green to green. How copy, over?
Steel 96, this is 716, roger, over. 16, Steel 91, 1 pack, green, green, over. This is 716, roger, over.
16, Steel 92, 1 Victor, 2 packs, Redcon 1, over.